The crate sat in a passage a fortnight with the lid off. 8 shillings the lot, signed in the steward's own hand. A dealer turned the saucer over and stopped speaking entirely. Then the steward came to take it back, and she refused. The crate sat in a passage a fortnight with the lid off, and every person in that house had walked past it. Footmen with coal scuttles, the undercook with a basket of leeks, Coombe himself twice a day rocking on his heels, daybook tucked under his arm, eyes sliding over the straw like it was something the dogs had dragged in. Margaret Aylward was the one who stopped. She'd come down the East Passage at 6:30 with a bundle of her ladyship's linen against her hip, sleeves pinned back above the elbow, the way they always were before she thought about it, and the low light through the high window caught something blue in the straw. She set the linen on the sill. 2 strands of dark, honey-brown hair had come loose at her temple, the way they did every single day of her life, and she pushed them back with the side of her wrist and knelt. What she lifted out was a saucer, blue and white, chipped along one edge, a clean bite out of the rim the size of a thumbnail. She turned it over. She didn't know why she turned it over. She only knew that her thumb had gone to the foot ring on its own, feeling the grit of the unglazed circle, and that the weight of the thing was wrong, too light. Lighter than the Ashcombe everyday wear by a quarter, and the glaze under the lamp had a faint blue pool in the dip where the household's Staffordshire went dead white. She held it a moment longer than she needed to. Then she wrapped it in her handkerchief and put it in her apron pocket, because she liked the blue, and because nobody in that house was going to miss it. Now, let's talk about whose crate it was. Ashcombe had spent 11 weeks clearing out the rooms of the late Miss Honoria Vane, the Duke's great-aunt, dead in March at 84 in a set of 3 north-facing rooms nobody had entered voluntarily in 20 years. The household had a word for Honoria, and the word was mad. Not sick, not old, mad. Said with that particular pleasure people take in a woman who was clever and inconvenient and finally had the decency to stop breathing. Her offense, as far as anyone could reconstruct it, was that she collected broken china. 40-odd pieces, none matching, most chipped, some cracked clean through and pinned with rivets. She wrote in a receipt book. She corresponded with dealers. She once refused a service of new Coalport and asked instead for the shards from the kitchen bin, and the kitchen never got over it. Coombe's summary, delivered to the housekeeper in the corridor with his spectacles up on his sallow forehead: sentimental rubbish from a woman who lost her wits before the old king lost his. Sweep it into a crate and let the servants pick over it. They'll take anything if it's free. He said that in front of 4 servants. He didn't notice. The receipt book went into the crate too, wedged down the side under the straw. Margaret found it the second evening. Small, brown calf, the spine gone soft. Page after page of marks copied out in a fine, steady hand. Crossed swords, a crescent, an anchor, a script letter N, with dates and prices and little notes on paste and glaze and where the blue ran. Honoria had drawn the marks herself, freehand, over and over until she had them right. And on the inside cover, in ink gone brown, one line: "Nothing is ruined until someone decides it is." Margaret read it standing in a cold passage with a crate of other people's contempt at her feet. She read it twice. Then she put the book back exactly where she'd found it, because it wasn't hers yet, and she went up the back stairs to warm her ladyship's shawl. She was 29. She'd been a lady's maid at Ashcombe 6 years, and a housemaid 4 before that, and she was good at it, in the way that gets you no credit at all. The seam repaired before anyone saw it fail, the stain out of gray silk before breakfast. Slate blue wool gown, cream apron, gray knitted shawl folded at the shoulders, gray blue eyes and a scatter of freckles across the bridge of her nose, and a pale birthmark the size of a thumbprint on her left jaw, under the ear, which one of the footmen had once called a smudge, and she had never once bothered to answer. She didn't argue with people, she just kept working. It's a habit that looks like meekness until it isn't. The servants' sale was held the last Tuesday in April in the servants' hall, deal table dragged into the middle, rain coming sideways at the yard door. Coombe presided because Coombe presided over everything, rocking back on his heels, brass buttons on the mustard waistcoat catching the lamp. Mrs. Pring, the housekeeper, on his left, 2 housemaids at the wall with their hands behind them, there to witness and to enjoy themselves. The crate came up last. Coombe didn't even lift a piece out. Lot 9, the Mad Aunt's leavings, 40 pieces of chipped crockery not fit for the dairy. He let that sit. Then, over his spectacles, 8 shillings, and I'd say that's charity. Any takers? No? Quite. Some people are born with sense." Somebody at the back laughed. Margaret stood up. She'd never spoken in that room in 10 years except to answer. She walked to the deal table without hurry, hands clasped low in front of her, sleeves still pinned, and she said 4 words. "I'll take it. 8. The laugh stopped. Coombs' pale blue eyes came up, and something moved across his face that wasn't surprise. It was that soft delight of a man watching someone he despises make a mistake he can record. He didn't ask if she was certain, he wanted her to be certain. She counted the coins out of a folded square of cloth. 8 shillings. 3 months of putting aside, laid one at a time on the deal table, and each one made a small, flat sound in a very quiet room. Coombe opened his daybook, dipped the pen, wrote the line, and signed it without once looking up. The ink hadn't finished drying when she got her hands under the crate. Coombe watched her lift it, 60-odd pounds of straw and old porcelain, and did not move from the doorframe, because moving would have meant helping, and helping would have meant admitting the woman had bought something worth carrying. He rocked back on his heels the way he does, daybook tucked under his arm like a magistrate's warrant. "Mind the banister with that rubbish," he said. "It's the only thing in the house with any value left." 8 shillings. He'd sold a dead woman's life for 8 shillings and still found room to sneer at the stairs. Margaret carried it up herself, 4 flights, resting on the 4th step where the wood creaks. It always creaks, and she'd learned to love that creak. And by the time she set it down in the little east room under the roof, the 2 loose strands at her temple were stuck to her cheek, and her arms were shaking. She unpinned her sleeves, then pinned them straight back above the elbow again. That's who she is. Rest is for after. Then she began to wash. Warm water, not hot. Hot water crazes old glaze, opens it up like frost on a window. A basin, a soft cloth, and Bran. Bran, because soap leaves a film and sand scours, and Bran is soft and dry and lifts 120 years of chimney soot without touching the surface underneath. She'd read that in Honoria's hand on the 3rd page. She trusted it before she understood it. Piece by piece, the crate gave up its dead. A tea bowl the color of skimmed milk. A slop basin with a hairline running from rim to foot. A saucer, blue and white, with a chip out of the edge no bigger than a thumbnail. And her hands learned faster than her eyes. Glaze first, you feel it. Hard paste porcelain is cold under the fingers, and the glaze sits on it like ice on a pond, thin and glassy and separate. Soft paste is warmer, softer, the glaze sinking into the body so the two are one thing, and when there's a chip you can see it. Hard paste breaks clean and white like a sugar loaf. Soft paste breaks grainy, almost like a broken biscuit. She turned each piece over and ran her thumb round the foot rim, the unglazed ring on the underside where the piece stood in the kiln. That ring tells the truth. It's the one place nobody bothered to make beautiful. Firing flaws came next. A black speck buried under glaze. Kiln grit, not damage. A faint ripple in the foot where the piece had slumped a half degree too hot. A pinhole. A stilt mark. 3 little rough dots where the piece sat on its supports in the fire. Still there. Still exactly where a man in Dresden set them down before Napoleon was born. And then she ruined one. A coffee can, gilded at the rim, and the gilding was dull under the soot, so she pressed harder, and the cloth came away with a smear of gold on it. Just like that. 200 years of a gilder's afternoon lifted off in one confident stroke of a clean rag. She sat down on the floor and did not cry. She looked at the gold on the cloth for a long time, and then she wrote in the margin of the receipt book, in pencil, under Honoria's ink, "Gilding is not fired hard. Stop before you think you should." That's the whole method, really. Stop before you think you should. The book itself took her 3 weeks of evenings. Honoria Aylward had written like a woman who expected to be understood by nobody, which meant she wrote for herself, which meant she wrote honestly. Marks, page after page of them, copied by hand, crossed swords in underglaze blue for Meissen, and the note beside it. The swords must sit in the glaze, not on it. If the blue looks printed and sits proud, it is a lie told in Staffordshire. An anchor, a crowned N, a crescent, and the crossed out ones, the fakes she'd been sold and kept anyway, labeled, paid 4 guineas, learnt more than 4 guineas worth. And on the flyleaf, the sentence Margaret would end up saying out loud for the rest of her life. Nothing is ruined until someone decides it is. He found her on the 18th of that month. The Duke of Ashcombe had come up the back stairs because the front hall was full of coom, and he stopped on the landing because there was a woman kneeling on bare boards with a basin, sleeves pinned back above the elbow, the pale thumbprint birthmark under her ear catching the window light, holding a saucer up to that light and turning it slowly. And she did not look up, because she genuinely did not know he was there, and would not have hurried if she had. He watched for the length of about 40 heartbeats. He turned the signet ring on his little finger. Then he went back down without a word, and could not have told you, under oath, what he had gone upstairs for in the first place. He came back Thursday, and the Thursday after. His mother noticed on the second one. The dowager sat by the morning-room fire with the tortoise-shell box on her lap, chin up, needle going, and said to nobody in particular, "He has crossed that yard 4 times since breakfast. In 38 years, he has never once had business in the linen loft." Then she went back to her needlework. She always does. Margaret didn't notice any of it. She had a half-day owing to her, and she spent it on the bath coach with 3 pieces wrapped in her own shawl on her knees, the tea bowl, a small covered pot, and the chipped blue and white saucer she'd carried in a handkerchief since the day she found it. Fenn's shop was down a lane off Milsom Street, a window so grimed you had to want to look in. A wiry, gray-haired man with round spectacles pushed up on his head and a brass loop hanging at his chest. She set the saucer on the counter and he turned it over, and Josiah Fenn did not speak for a full minute. A full minute is a very long time in a shop that small. The clock ticked. A cart went by outside. Josiah Fenn, stooped at the shoulders, gray hair pushed behind his ears, kept the brass loop screwed into his eye and the chipped blue and white saucer tilted toward the window light, and said nothing at all. Margaret Aylward stood with her hands clasped low in front of her, the way she always stood, sleeves still pinned back above the elbow because she'd walked in from the coach without thinking to unpin them. She waited. She was good at waiting. 15 years of service teaches you that a person will tell you what they want eventually, and hurrying them only makes them lie. Then Fenn lowered the loop. "Where," he said, "did you get crossed swords?" She didn't know what that meant. He turned the saucer so she could see the underside, that little blue mark she'd taken for a smudge of glaze, 2 thin sabers crossed at the hilt, painted under the glaze by a hand dead 100 years. Meissen. Not Staffordshire, not a bow imitation, not the sort of thing a housekeeper carts off in a crate. Royal Saxon porcelain from Dresden, the first hard paste made in Europe, and the reason half the crowned heads of the continent had gone slightly mad buying it. Here's the small noise. A housekeeper pays 8 shillings for a crate of chipped rubbish nobody at the great house wanted, because her aunt's receipt book said nothing is ruined until someone decides it is. Here's the catastrophic failure. 40 pieces of 18th century Meissen, a partial dinner service, cups, saucers, 2 sauceboats, a cracked tureen lid, had left Ashcombe in a farm cart, sold as breakage, by a man who could not be bothered to turn a plate over. Fenn asked how many. She told him. 40, give or take the tureen lid, some chipped, 3 cracked clean through. He sat down. He got up again. He pushed his spectacles further up into his hair and asked, in the careful voice of a man trying not to spook a horse, whether she would take £420 for the lot, sight unseen, on his word. Sit with that number a moment. Margaret's wage at Ashcombe was £12 a year, paid quarterly, less the cost of her own candles. £420 was 35 years of standing in cold corridors. It was a freehold cottage and a garden, and never again having to ask a man in a mustard waistcoat for permission to use the back stair after dark. Her whole savings, scraped together across 15 years, came to £19 and some coppers, and 8 of those shillings were currently sitting in Silas Coombs' estate day book under the word rubbish. She looked at the saucer. Her aunt's saucer, the chipped one she carried wrapped in a handkerchief, the one that had started the whole thing. "I'll need it in writing," she said. Fenn blinked. Then he laughed, one short bark, and reached for his pen, because dealers know the sound of someone who is not going to be robbed. She did not sell that day. She took his written offer, folded it into her apron pocket, and went home to the cottage with the 4th stair that creaked, and she did the thing that separates lucky people from dangerous ones. She verified it herself. Every piece out of the straw, every piece turned over. her aunt's receipt book open on the table beside a tallow candle, in that thin, looping hand that stopped mid-page on a Tuesday in March, with its notes on marks and pastes, and the philosophy the household had called eccentric, and her aunt had simply called looking properly. Crossed swords, some with a dot between the hilts, some without, paste held to the candle. True Meissen glows a warm cream when the light comes through it, grayish and clean, not the dead chalk white of the cheap stuff. 38 pieces sang. 2 did not. The cup and its saucer, the prettiest pair in the crate, the ones with the little painted birds she'd liked best, held to the flame, they went dull, gray, opaque as a pebble. She turned them over, and the swords were there, but the paint sat wrong, thick, riding on top of the glaze instead of sunk beneath it, and one saber crossed the other at a lazy angle a Dresden master would have been beaten for. Later copies. 19th century Dresden decorating shops slapping a dead factory's mark on someone else's blanks and selling it to the credulous. She sat back and let the disappointment go through her, and then she got out a scrap of paper and wrote down what she'd learned. Glow, not color. Paint under the glaze, not on it. The angle of the swords. She set the 2 fakes on the shelf by the door, deliberately, where she'd see them every morning. You keep your failures where you can look at them. That's how they stop being failures. Word traveled the way word always travels, through a kitchen. The bath coach driver told a Ashcombe groom that the housekeeper had been in a dealer's shop on Milsom Street. The groom told the scullery. By Thursday, the servants' hall had it that Margaret Aylward had gone soft in the head over a dead aunt's crockery, and by Friday, one of the footmen was doing an impression of her carrying a saucer wrapped in a handkerchief like a christening. They laughed. Of course they laughed. A woman who spends her half-day cataloging broken plates is comedy, right up until she isn't. The laughter thinned by the following week. Whispers replaced it. That Fenn had offered her something, that the something was large, that the number being said aloud in the stable yard was too absurd to repeat, and being repeated constantly. Then the whispering stopped altogether. That's the sound money makes when it enters a room, because it reached the estate office, and Silas Coombe, rocking back on his heels with his spectacles catching the light, opened the daybook to the page in his own hand where he had written, "Lot of damaged china, disposed, 8 shillings, received," and did the arithmetic of a man watching £420 walk out of his ledger in a farm cart he'd personally authorized. He was at her door before noon on Saturday, daybook closed under his arm, asking for the lot back as estate property. He didn't shout. That's the thing about men like Silas Coombe, they never have to. He stood in her doorway with the daybook closed under his arm, rocking gently back on his heels, sallow and pleased, his silver-rimmed spectacles catching the gray light off the yard, and he made it sound like a favor. The estate had reviewed the matter. The estate had concerns. The crate of Ashcombe porcelain in her passage was, upon reflection, ducal property mislaid during a clearance, and its continued presence in a laundrymaid's cottage raised, he let the word sit there, questions. About her position, about her character, about what a woman of her station might be doing with 340 pieces of vain family china stacked against her wall. Then he offered her £10. £10, for a service whose 4 surviving Chelsea pieces alone Josiah Fenn had valued at 90 guineas, and the whole lot, restored and matched, at somewhere near 400. Coombe named the figure the way you'd toss bread at a duck, and he added, still smiling, still rocking, "Be sensible, Miss Aylward. You wash sheets. Nobody in this county is going to take the word of a laundry maid over the word of the estate, and I'd hate to see you turned out over a misunderstanding. Take the £10 and be grateful somebody thought of you at all." That's not an offer. That's a hand on the back of the neck. Margaret Aylward stood in her own doorway with her sleeves pinned back above the elbow and her hands clasped low in front of her, dark honey-brown hair coiled at the nape with the 2 loose strands at her temple, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not take a step back. She said she'd think on it. She shut the door. Then she stood in the cold passage with her palm flat on the crate lid for a long, long minute. Because he was right about one thing, the smug little accountant, her word against the estates was no contest at all. That same week, John Purley came up the lane. Under butler at the great house, 34, decent as bread, hands scrubbed pink, hat turned round and round in them. He didn't sneer at the china. He simply said a married woman with a settled man had no need of trouble, that his rooms were dry and his wages were £42 a year, and that he'd be glad, genuinely glad, to take her out of all this. There was nothing to hate in him. That's what made it hard. He was safety, offered honestly, and safety is the most reasonable thing anybody will ever hand you. She thanked him. She said no. She did it gently, and she watched him walk back down the lane, and she felt the size of what she had just refused settle onto her shoulders like wet wool. If you have been waiting for the moment it nearly broke her, this is it. The rain came in that night off the downs, hammering the slates, finding the gap over the scullery. She sat at the kitchen table with one tallow candle guttering and her gray shawl folded round her, and the chipped blue and white saucer unwrapped from its handkerchief in front of her, and she added it up honestly. £9 saved, a cottage held at the estate's pleasure, 230 pieces still crazed, still stained brown at the footrims, a firing she hadn't cracked, a glaze that had bloomed milky on her last 4 trials because she'd let the kiln come up too fast. £10 and a quiet life sat on that table beside the candle, warm and easy and entirely available. She was that close. Anyone would have been. Then she pulled Honoria's book toward her, her aunt's hand, brown ink, the diagrams of stacked saggers, the page that stopped mid-sentence on a Thursday in March. And there it was again, 3rd line down, underscored twice. Nothing is ruined until someone decides it is. She read it 3 times. Then she turned the candle up and went back to the kiln and slowed the rise by 2 hours, and the milky bloom never came back. But she didn't beat Coombe with a kiln. She beat him with paper, because Honoria Aylward had been a great deal of things the parish called mad, and one of them was thorough. In the back of the book, folded into the binding, was a sale record dated the 11th of October, ledger-ruled, listing 1 crate of damaged Ashcombe service, sold as rubbish, 3 shillings received, signed by the purchaser, countersigned by the seller, witnessed by the carter, Thomas Hale, and by the undergardener, William Nye, both of them still drawing wages within a mile of that yard, and the seller's signature, in his own cramped hand, dry as a summons. S. Coombe, steward. She let him come back for it. She let him stand in her doorway again, rocking on his heels, holding out £10 in a folded paper. She set the sale record on the table where he could read it, and she waited while he did, and she watched the color go out of his sallow face 1 shade at a time. "That is not for sale," she said. "Those are my terms." 9 words. They ended him. Because the record went up to the great house, carried by Hale himself, who'd been waiting 11 years for a reason, and Henry Vane, Duke of Ashcombe, read his own steward's signature under the word rubbish, and understood at last who had dumped his mother's wedding service in a passage and then tried to buy it back for the price of a bad hat. The dowager was in the morning room when he came in, seated very straight with the tortoise-shell box on her lap, sharp, pale gray eyes not lifting from her needle. She let him turn the ring on his little finger twice before she spoke. "You have found 4 reasons to cross that yard since Michaelmas, Henry. None of them were the china." He stood at the window with one hand behind his back and turned the signet ring and said it plainly. "Then I shall find a 5th, and I will not be dismissing her. I will be dismissing Coombe." The morning room held that sentence like a held breath. Henry Vane stood at the window with one hand behind his back, turning the plain gold signet on his right little finger, and he did not take the words back. Margaret stood by the table with her sleeves still pinned above the elbow, apron marked at the hip where she'd wiped a wet thumb, and she did not pretend she hadn't heard. Coombe heard it too. "That's the part I want you to sit inside." He stood in the doorway with the estate daybook under his arm, spectacles catching the east light, rocking back on his heels the way he always did before he explained to somebody why they were wrong, and he had nothing to explain. His whole method was gone. He'd built 12 years of authority on being the only man in the house who knew what things were worth, and a laundress with a chipped blue and white saucer had just priced a crate he'd once ordered carted to the tip. This was the man who'd told her, standing over that crate, that she should be grateful the estate let her sleep under its roof at all, that she was staff, and staff did not have opinions about porcelain, that she'd always be somebody carrying other people's linen, and the sooner she made peace with it, the easier her life would go. He wasn't dismissed. That's the thing. Nobody shouted. He simply stopped being asked. The Duke sent the fen inventory to be checked against Margaret's list, not Coombs. The Dowager sent for Margaret when a dinner service came up from the Ashcombe cellar and wanted the marks read aloud. Coombe kept his daybook. Nobody opened it. 6 weeks after that morning, he came down the stone passage himself. Short, quick steps, sallow, the freckled backs of his hands folded over the leather cover. He stopped where the third crate sat with its lid off, and he looked at a saucer she'd laid out on a folded cloth, and for the first time in his life, he asked a real question. He asked how she could tell a Worcester crescent from a bow one when both were blue and both were smudged. She told him. Glaze thickness at the foot rim, the way bow paste holds the light like wet chalk. He listened all the way to the end. No apology. There never is. Just a man learning something at 52 from a woman he'd called nothing. Then the county turned, the way counties do, slowly, then all at once, and never in words. A bath dealer came first, sent by Josiah Fenn, hazel-eyed and stooped and peering, loop swinging on its cord, wanting 14 pieces identified from a house sale in Somerset. He paid 2 guineas for the afternoon. Then a viscountess 40 miles off, who would not name her source to anybody and wrote on unmarked paper, sent a hamper of Chelsea figures with the heads knocked off and asked what could be saved. Margaret saved 9 of 11 and priced them at £460, and the Viscountess's man of business paid it without a murmur. And then Mrs. Wiccan, the Ashcombe housekeeper, the same woman who'd once told her to sweep the shards up and stop making a spectacle, came down that passage with a bundle in her arms. Her own pieces, her mother's, broken 30 years and kept in a box because she couldn't bear the throwing out. She stood there holding it like a woman at a church door. Margaret took the bundle and said she'd need a week. That's the whole apology. A week. By the following spring, it had terms in writing because Margaret Aylward was not a fool. 10 shillings for an identification, 2 guineas a day for a house, a third of realized value on anything she placed with a dealer, payment in advance, and a waiting list that ran to 19 names and then 26. She worked out of the back rooms behind the still room, 3 trestle tables, walnut-stained cloths, a shelf of Honoria's notebooks in that thin, looping hand that stopped mid-page. Nothing is ruined until someone decides it is. She read it most mornings before she read anything else. The Duke found reasons, he always did. A question about the cellar, a letter from Fenn he could perfectly well have sent down with a footman. He stood in her doorway with one hand behind his back, watching her turn a cracked bowl under lamplight, and the Dowager, seated very straight with the tortoiseshell box on her lap, said to nobody in particular that her son had crossed that yard 4 times on a Tuesday it rained. He asked her in October, in the passage, no ring, no speech. "I would rather have you than the good opinion of every house in this county," he said. "I have thought about it for a year, and I cannot make it come out any other way." It cost him. 3 families stopped inviting him. The London papers were unkind in the coded way that's worse than plain. She said yes because of the crate, because of the night he'd carried the second crate up from the yard himself, in the rain, with no witness but a wet horse, and had never once mentioned it after. They married in the village church in February. 11 people, stone that holds the cold in July and murder in winter. She wore the slate blue wool. 2 strands loose at the temple, the way they always were. The freckles across her nose showed pink in that light. The work never stopped for it. There was an order due to Bath on the Friday. 22 years on, that same stone passage smells of walnut and damp straw, and there's a crate on the floor with the lid off and packing spilling over the edge. Margaret's hair has gone pale at the temples, still parted centrally, still coiled low. Beside her stands a housemaid of 19, holding a saucer in 2 hands like it might bite. Margaret takes it, turns it to the light, sets it down. "Nothing is ruined," she says, "until someone decides it is." The girl writes it in the back of a notebook. Somewhere in this county right now, there's a crate somebody's about to burn. Go look at it.